Okay, welcome to week 6. As we began our consideration of these domains of everyday life, you may recall that I mentioned that our first two domains, home and work, they highlight one of the underlying ways that we often compartmentalize our lives. We often talk about our lives as being both private and public. For many Americans, much of life is spent in one of these two domains, and it's easy to think about the things that happen at the home as essentially private matters, and all the stuff that happens beyond the home, things like work, are in a sense public. And so this week we're talking about this domain that we're calling our public lives. And in doing so, the central question for us this week is this: what kind of public life is Jesus calling us to? But there are many reasons why living out a public faith is challenging in contemporary life. As Christian Sharon has pointed out in his chapter on citizenship and government, he says there that our churches provide both personal affirmation and care for their members and create social networks, which can provide for an important site for organizing around shared communal values and concerns. Yet Americans often find it difficult to connect the local sense of community that they find in a congregation to the large-scale forces and institutions that shape our lives. At the same time, Nancy Ammerman points out in her chapter this week that despite how hard it is for many individuals and congregations to make this connection to public life, her research suggests that communities of faith remain important agents in forming our American public life. She writes, quote, "Local congregations are among the most important institutional sources for moral education and for voluntary engagement in local community social service. The pervasiveness of local congregations and their networks of affiliated organizations make them powerful players in social service delivery. And the institutional patterns that shape congregational life in the United States mean that they are expected to provide opportunities for worship, religious education, for fellowship and mutual care, and for service to the broader community." Now, when I introduced this concept of culture, I mentioned that part of what shapes our culture, that is, remember, our shared values and symbols and stories, are these large-scale social, economic, and political institutions. When we ask this central question about what kind of public life Jesus is inviting us into, part of what we're talking about is those parts of our lives that are shaped by these kinds of institutions. But we're also talking about something even more basic than that. And so before we go any further, I'd like to unpack a bit this dichotomy that we often use between the private and the public. When scholars enter into discussions like these, they often have in mind the well-known German philosopher George Hegel. That's because Hegel introduced what was in his day a very novel idea, that of the civil society. Curiously, what exactly Hegel meant by this term is the subject of endless debates. But what is clear is that the domain of life that he refers to with this term, it is the sole domain of neither the state, nor the individual, nor the church. For Hegel, this domain of the civil society encapsulates two distinct kinds of action: public action and political action. Now, often today we confuse these two terms. We use them interchangeably. But for Hegel, we could say that the public refers to more than mere politics. And perhaps to clarify things, we'll add one more word to this: policy. So now we have these three P words, right? We have the public, we have politics, and policy. So let's get some more definitions on the table. Public is the broadest of these terms. It has multiple meanings. Most basically, it means the people, like as in we the people, right? But it also means a quality of openness or accessibility, as in a public library or a publicly traded company. And so together, these first two meanings help show that in a very basic way, to talk about our public lives is to talk about our collective lives, or dare I go ahead and say, our collective lives together, right? But there's one more meaning that we need to consider. Public also means being altered, as in the root of the word puberty, or that developmental stage in which a young person begins to take responsibility for the consequences of their actions. To be engaged in a public life is a shared responsibility, a collective responsibility. Now, what about our two other words, right? Well, policy refers to the ends of our public or collective lives, and politics is the means by which we enact those policies. Now, most often we use this language to think about the official policies and politics of our public lives, but it's also good to keep in mind that these play out in unofficial and unspoken ways as well. Think back for a moment to Sharon's chapter on lives self-maximized. There he introduces a key concept, individualism. Quoting Tocqueville, he writes that individualism is a calm and considered feeling which disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows and withdraw to a circle of his family and friends. With his little society formed to his taste, he gladly leaves the greater society to look after itself. Or to put it another way, individualism is a way of naming the tendency in our culture to allow our private affairs to dominate our public lives. Now, with these definitions in mind, I'd like to push towards three strategies for thinking about our central question. What kind of public lives is Jesus calling us to? But before we get to those, I want to briefly mention two key Lutheran theological insights, what we often call the two kingdoms, and one key theory from sociology. You may remember Lutherans are known for their paradoxes. Law and gospel, sinner and saint, here and not yet, and so forth. Well, another one of these paradoxes that Luther uses is the idea that the kingdom of God is made up of two kingdoms. Sometimes Luther even calls this two forms of righteousness. Luther wrote that the kingdom of God works within two domains, and at times he refers to these as the kingdom of earth, or even the kingdom of man, and the kingdom of heaven. At other times, he'll simply talk about the left hand and the right hand, the left meaning the kingdom of earth, and the right meaning the kingdom of heaven. Now, with the left hand, the kingdom of earth, there are limits. Here on earth, we still live with the consequences of sin, and here we are broken people. It's only in the kingdom of the right hand that there is complete reconciliation. So when it came to thinking about our collective public lives, Luther wrote that God has provided governance. He's provided order in both of these kingdoms. On the left, God makes use of our broken systems and structures, even makes use of broken people, towards this end of seeing God's will be done, on earth as it is in heaven, as we say, right? And of course, on the right, in the kingdom of God, God is God, and God is sovereign, and so God's will always is always done in the kingdom of heaven. Now, in this way, Luther was actually very fond of political order and state authority. And even though both the church and the state were located in the kingdom of earth, that is with the left hand, they had separate messages, separate missions. Or we could put it differently, that the church had a spiritual authority, and the state had a temporal authority. In one of his well-known treatises called On Temporal Authority and the Extent to Which It Should Be Obeyed, Luther wrote, "Just as the Christian performs all other works of love, which he himself does not need, he does not visit the sick in order that he himself may be made well, or feed others because he himself needs food, so he serves the governing authority, not because he needs it, but for the sake of others, that they may be protected, and that the wicked may not become worse." This way of thinking about service to temporal authority fits squarely within Luther's broader theology of vocation. We are always called to love and serve our neighbor. That is the purpose of our work. Now, this does not mean that temporal authority is without its limits, and that Christians should always obey temporal authority. If ever that authority stands in the way of loving the neighbor, or if their actions prove to obscure faith, they become obstacles to faith, then they should not be obeyed. Remember, it was the emperor himself that Luther said no to when such a temporal authority demanded that he recant of his own theological writings. So to sum up this first point, this Lutheran insight here, Luther saw great potential for a partnership between the church and the state, since after all, both kingdoms, the left and right, were ultimately governed by God. So it should become as no surprise to anyone, right, that for much of Europe, much of the territories which followed in Luther in his Reformation, we get state churches, right? Okay, now I'd like to mention a key theory from the sociology of religion. And to understand this theory, you need to understand two very closely related concepts. One is called secularization and the other called privatization. These two belong together, and you can think of them as sort of twins. Now, Max Weber, who I've mentioned before, is often thought of as the father of sociology. In his writings, he poignantly writes about the effect that Luther, his ideas, and the Reformation had on German society. Weber wrote that before Luther, there were clear distinctions between that which we might call the secular and that which we might call the sacred. In reference to Luther's priesthood of all believers, and he notes that when the monastery walls, quote, came down, there were no longer two distinct worlds, just one world, the secular one. So what he's saying there, right, is this idea that when Luther went after monasticism, he, perhaps on purpose, perhaps inadvertently, created a situation in which the distinctions between what was sacred and what was secular were blurred. Everybody is a priest, right? Now, the social and the political developments that followed Luther in his Reformation dramatically reshaped Europe and subsequently, right, its colonies. When the German princes stood up to the emperor and protected Luther, they opened the door to what we now know as the nation-state. The printing press that printed Luther's German Bible, that initiated huge educational reforms. And during the Reformation, new religious and political structures emerged throughout Germany, in Geneva, and in England. One stunning result of the Reformation was an unprecedented amount of religious diversity. Now, jumping ahead a bit, many of those who settled in the American colonies, they were, in a sense, religious outcasts. They were a displaced people who, in the midst of this wave of religious diversity, didn't have a place to go. Displaced by their religious commitments and visions, there's a sense in which the American experiment has always been fertile ground for religious experimentation and innovation. And it's this diversity that led to the idea of separation of church and state, an idea that stood in stark contrast, of course, to the pattern of state churches in Europe, themselves, of course, a direct result of the Reformation. Now, part of what Weber observed in his own lifetime was that with these new social and political arrangements came a natural kind of differentiation. And by that, he means that certain institutions were responsible for certain domains. He named three: the church, the state, and the market. Now, perhaps you can see how this was, in a sense, a quite natural extension from Luther's two kingdoms, his sense that there is both a spiritual authority and a temporal authority, different kinds of authority for different kinds of domains. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, industrialization, science, and technological advancements led to further specialization and differentiation, so that by the mid-20th century, social conditions in industrialized societies led some theorists to hypothesize about the future of religion. In their book, The Sacred Canopy, Thomas Luckman and Peter Berger, they posited that faced with so much religious diversity, Western societies would inevitably secularize. And by this, they mean that societies would sort of enter this process in which, and I'll quote, that the sectors of society and culture are removed from the domination of religious institutions and symbols. When we, Luckman and Berger, speak of society and institutions in modern Western history, of course, secularization manifests itself in the evacuation by the Christian churches of areas previously under their control or influence. Now, they go on to argue that this is an empirical reality. It is inevitable. And they hypothesize that the more a society modernizes, the more it will secularize. And the result would be the decline of religion. Well, that was the theory anyways. Now, for a long time, this theory held. But it was Peter Berger himself who was one of the first to disclaim this thesis when the data proved otherwise. In the 1980s, religion exploded. And in particular, it was conservative religion and new religious movements that proved that such a one-to-one correspondence between modernization and secularization didn't really exist. Now, contemporary theorists today often admit that this thesis of Luckman and Berger's, that it didn't quite pan out. But they also note that religion today is more privatized. That is, beliefs are thought of as more subjective, a matter of personal choice, and not something that is established or assumed to be shared across the diversity of people that exist in modern public life. So all this talk of theory and social life, it raises this question: how can Christians today engage with a public faith? This is a question that many contemporary theologians are working on. I would go so far as to say it's one of the most pressing theological conversations. While we don't have the time in this course to consider this question so widely and thoroughly, I do want to conclude with three possible strategies. And if you'd like to learn more about this, please do let me know. One of the possible future courses Wartburg has considered offering is a course on public theology and witness. And that would be a course where we would spend the entire length of a course really asking these questions of public faith. Well, there are many variations on the three strategies that I'd like to mention here in conclusion, but briefly, I'll just name each and then offer up an exemplar of its practice. And we can discuss more details about these in the forums, just sort of based on your interest in them. So the first one I want to talk about is faith-based organizing. Now, faith-based organizing has its roots in the labor movement, especially the organizing techniques pioneered by Saul Alinsky and his Industrial Areas Foundation. And here I particularly want to point to the work of Gamaliel and to the PICO network. These two organizations work with local leaders to build up conversations around faith-based values and to put them into action, usually in their local and regional communities. Faith-based organizations have been an incredible impact on the political process, and they've had a big role in making Christian values a part of key policy decisions. It's a really interesting strategy. Now, a second one would be something like social services and advocacy. And since the establishment of the very first hospitals and orphanages in the United States, social service provision has always been a joint partnership between government, churches, and other civic organizations. Together, the ELCA and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod have one of the most expansive social service networks. The counterpoint, perhaps, to direct service is always something like advocacy. That's always at the level of policy. Lutherans have often been engaged in local, state, and national policy debates. And here I just want to lift up three wonderful examples of advocacy. And these are in the form of three op-eds offered up by Lutheran bishops. So please do check those out. These are wonderful examples of advocacy for particular policies. And last, I just want to mention international development. This is in some ways related to social service, but it's also a bit different. And we have, as Lutherans, an incredible international development and disaster relief ministry. Both Lutheran Disaster Response and Lutheran World Relief play a vital public ministry in this way. The ELCA's Office of Global Mission and the regional programs of the Lutheran World Federation also contribute to this extensively. And perhaps here the key distinctive that I want to name is that these organizations and this strategy puts an emphasis on accompaniment, which is a model that raises up local leaders and their capacities for social change. Okay, that's a lot, I know. But we can, of course, continue the conversation in the forums this week. And so I look forward to seeing you there.